Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are from Group 4. We will talk about quantitative research about population and sample, the sampling technique, and data collection. Okay, now let me introduce myself. My name is Siti al-Khumairo from Group 4. I will continue the presentation about data collection in quantitative research. The data collection methods are used to collect quantitative research data, and the results are dependent on the larger sample size that are commonly representing the population researcher intend to study. There are 5 steps in the process of data collection in quantitative research. For the first is about selecting participants that used to identify the people and places you plan to study, and the second is about obtaining permissions that used to obtain their permission to be studied, and the third is about selecting types of data that used to identify the variables in your questions and hypotheses, and the fourth is about identifying instruments that used to identify the instruments that will be used to collect the data, and the last is administering data collection that used to administer the data collection. For the first steps is obtain activity about identify your unit of analysis and then specify the population and sample, and for the second steps is obtain different types of permissions and obtain informed consent, and the third steps obtain specify the variables from research question and hypothesis, and then operationally define its variable, and then choose types of data and measures, and then for the next steps obtain some activity about locate or develop an instrument, and then search for an instrument, and then criteria for choosing a good instrument, and then interval or ratio scales, and the last is about think aloud about finding and selecting an instrument. For the last steps is administering data collection. There are some activities in these steps. It is about standardization and ethical issues. Okay, now we are going to the first steps that is about selecting participants. What participants will you study? These steps includes 2 activities that is about identify unit of analysis and specify the population and sample. For the first steps is about identify unit of analysis. The main question is who can supply the information that you will use to answer your quantitative research questions or hypotheses? Some possibilities might be students, teachers, parents, adults, some combination of these individuals or entire schools. At this early stage in data collection, you must decide at what level the data needs to be gathered. This level is referred to as the unit of analysis. And then, for specify the population and sample, a target population or sampling frame is a group of individuals or groups with some common defining characteristics that the researcher can identify and study. And then, for the second steps is about obtaining permissions. What permissions will you need? For these steps includes 2 activities that is about obtain different types of permissions, and the second is obtain informed consent. For the first is about obtain different types of permissions. Permissions is often necessary before you can enter a site and collect data. This approval usually comes from leaders or persons of authority in organizations. Gaining permissions from organizational personnel requires contracting them before the start of a study and obtaining their permission to enter and to study their setting. The best way to seek permissions from the necessary individuals or groups is to ask for it formally in a letter. Include the purpose of the study, the amount of time you will be at the site collecting data, the time required of participants, and how you will use the data or results. And then, for the second activity is obtain informed consent. It is important to protect the privacy and confidentiality of individuals who participate in the study. Then, the third steps in the process of data collection in quantitative research is selecting types of data. What information will you collect? There are 3 activities in the steps. The first is specify variables from research, and then operationally define each variable, and the last choose types of data and measures. In the first activities, specify variables from research. Research questions and hypotheses contain variables. To determine what data need to be collected, you need to identify clearly the variables in your study. This will include independent, dependent, and control variables. A useful strategy is to make a list of the variables so that you can determine what variables are operating in a study. And the next activities is operationally define each variable. Many definitions of variables are possible, such as a dictionary definition, but researchers use an operational definition. An operational definition is the specification of how you will define and measure the variable in your study. You can find definition in published research studies on your topic. And then choose types of data and measures, considering types of information that will help you assess these variables. This is the flow of activities and their example in collecting data in quantitative research, with the variable is self-efficacy. For the flow activities, identify the variable. The example is self-efficacy for learning from others. And then determine operationally define the variable. The example is level of confidence that an individual can learn something by being taught by others. And then for flow of activities, locate the data. The example is 13 items on a self-efficacy attitude scale from Bergin 1989. And the flow activities collect data on instruments yielding numeric scores. The example is scores of each item range from 0 to 10, with 10 being completely confident. Then the fourth steps in collecting the data is about what instrument will you use to collect the data. For the first is locate and develop an instrument. And then the second is search for an instrument. This includes several strategies that can aid in your search. For the first is look in published journal articles, and then run an ERIC or Education Research Information Center. Search and then examine quotes to test an instrument that are available commercially. The next activities is criteria for choosing a good instrument. There are some criteria that is the author developed the recently instrument, and then the instrument widely cited by the authors, and then the reviews available for the instrument. There is the information about validity and reliability, and then the procedure for recording data fit the research question or hypothesis, and then the instrument contain accepted scales of measurement. The next activities is interval and ratio scales. You determine the interval and ratio scales. And the last activities is think aloud about finding and selecting an instrument. Now we are going to the last steps in data collection in quantitative research, that is about administering the data collection. How will you administer the data collection? There are two activities in these steps. For the first is about standardization, and the next is ethical issues. Standardization obtain written procedures as well as other data collectors assisting in the process, help keep you on track. For interviewing using an instrument, you apply the same procedures to each individual. Instructions provided on the interview form will help ensure that you follow a standard process. And the next is ethical issues. Obtain protecting the anonymity of individuals by assigning numbers to return instruments and keeping the identity of individuals confidential offers privacy to participants. Okay, I think it's enough from our group. I'm sorry if there are any mistakes. Thanks for your attention, and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.